Welcome to the Heal, Thrive, Dream podcast, where trauma survivors become healthy thrivers. Each month, we'll feature a theme in the trauma recovery and empowerment field. To promote your recovery, healing, and learning how to build dreams, here's your host, Karen Robinson, transformational coach and therapist.
Hi there. Welcome to the Heal, Thrive, Dream podcast. Today, I have a special guest who is a reverend and a doctor. I'd like to introduce Dr. David Chotka. He has taught nationally and internationally on prayer principles and equipping for more than 25 years. He is the founder and director of Spirit Equip Ministries, an organization designed to help people grow in their spiritual disciplines one small step at a time. His website is spiritequip.com. He serves as the co-chair of the Alliance Pray, which is called APT, the Alliance Pray Team, APT, the prayer mobilization team of Christian and Missionary
Alliance, the CMA.
In Canada.
We call it the CMA. It doesn't mean the Canadian Medical Association. It means the Christian and Missionary Alliance. So,
well, thank you for coming on today.
Thank you very much. It's a delight to be with you.
And where are you located in Canada?
I'm only about 200 yards from the US border. So I'm right snugged up close. I'm in the city just south of Windsor, Ontario. I don't know if you know this. If you drive across the border, you have to drive north to go into the United States because of the funny turn in the river. So it's one of the few places in the country where you drive north to go to the US. But if you know the Great Lakes Basin and you're right down at the bottom tip, there's a little town called LaSalle just south of Windsor, and that's where I live. And only about 200 yards from the Detroit River, and on the other side is Michigan. So it's not hard for me to see the United States of America. And when I travel, I'm only like, you think miles, so 30 miles would be, but it's 50 kilometers, 30 miles for me to get to the Detroit Wayne County International Airport. That makes it very simple for travel.
Very nice. I actually grew up at a border town as well. My mom is American. My dad's Canadian.
Oh, praise the Lord. What town was that from?
Fort Fairfield, Maine, and Perth Andover, New Brunswick.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. East Coaster. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. So I lived in both places, and both of my grandfathers jumped to the border to find wives as well.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, they look good on both sides of the line.
Oh, dear. So before we talk about, we were having this little chit chat before recording. You said something really fun. Not many people can say this. You mentioned to me that you met the Pope. So can you just share that really quickly?
I did.
It's fun.
It was the craziest kind of a thing. So when I started in the ministry, I was stationed to a little tiny town in northern Alberta, and it's a little town called Lac La Biche. It's not the end of the world, but you can see it from there. At any rate, actually, really, literally, the road ends at Lac La Biche. It stops. And then in the wintertime, when it gets really cold, there's an ice bridge road for logging in the north. But apart from that ice road in the middle of the winter, there was no other road past that little town. It was a town of about 2,500 people. And so in the town, everybody knew everybody else. And all the pastors knew each other. And I walked up and I met the Roman Catholic priest. His name was Father Giuseppe Peroni. My name was David Chotka. Of course, my ethnic's Ukrainian. There was about 20% of the town was Ukrainian. There's a bunch of people who were Italian in that town. And we'd walk down the street together. And the children would say, "Oh, there's Reverend Chocolate and Father Pepperoni." So we had a lot of fun.
I think that's cute too. But talk about when you met the Pope.
Well, here's what happened. So I was friends with this Catholic priest. We used to pray together, and he was great friends with the Archbishop of the province of Diocese of Alberta, and the Pope John Paul II was coming to Edmonton, which was about a 3-hour drive south of where we were. And because he was friends, I got this invitation to go to the Pope's Mass in Edmonton. And I wound up at the Pope's Mass, and you have to wear appropriate liturgical vestments. And I had on a cassock alb, and everybody got the same stole that was put on. So I looked like a Franciscan. So I walked up and I was talking to the Franciscans and they said, "Oh, you're a Franciscan." At that moment, the bells began to ring and we had to go in a line to get out to be part of the mass. And I wound up standing next to John Paul II. It was like one of those crazy jokes with mistaken identity. There's all kinds of jokes about popes and people, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, it was a great honor. And I wound up sitting next to him. And it was just incredible. And as it turned out, my future wife was in the liturgical choir that was behind the Pope there. We were both at the same event, but I was only one of 6 Protestant clergy in that gathering of about 2,000 people. And so it was an honor to be there. And he was, in my mind, one of the most amazing people I ever met. I don't know if you know this. He spoke 25 languages and he had 3 doctoral degrees. Yeah. And he was a man, actually, when he was a young man, he had a crush on a Jewish girl. Just about married.
I didn't know that part, though.
Yeah, he just about did. And then he realized he was called to the ministry. So he had a warm relationship with Judaism and with the Orthodox Church and with the Catholic Church. And he stared down the Nazis and then he stared down the communists and brought Poland to a place of freedom. What an amazing leader, an incredible, astonishing, amazing leader.
Yes, yes, and yes. Well, that was a really nice story to share, I feel. Okay, and so let's switch gears a little bit. As you are aware, Dr. David, we're going to go with, right?
Yeah.
Dr. David, you know that my listeners are survivors of all kinds of different types of trauma. Yep. And so often the guests I have are either survivors themselves or they help survivors in some way. Yep. And more often or not, we're the same people. Do you have a trauma story that you feel comfortable sharing today?
Oh my, I've got all kinds of them. If I go back all the way in the background, when I was a little boy, actually, let me go, if this is generational, so I'm going to go back in the day. My dad's mother left his father because she used to get beaten by him. And that, of course, marked him when he was a little boy. And he told me stories about being chased around the backyard with an axe as this awful man was trying to pursue him, et cetera, et cetera. And she had to leave. There were 14 kids. He was the 14th and he was the youngest, and the second youngest and he were the 2 who were left when that lady left. And she went off to stay with all the relatives throughout their life because they knew exactly what was going on. But in the 1930s, nobody left. We're talking nobody. They just didn't do that. And so it had to have been really severe. But of course, that marked him. And in the end, it turned into abuse patterns that showed up in my childhood too. And it wasn't, my dad used to drink himself silly and smoke himself silly. And when he would drink, he would do one of 2 things. He'd either become like a calm little pussycat and almost pathetic. And the other was anger and rage and violence, that kind of thing. And he would scream and holler and yell, and then he would sob and so on and so forth. And I grew up in that. And that's, how do I say this? Depressing. It also doesn't teach you the life skills that you need to be able to succeed in society. You had to move beyond that. Of course, I didn't think it was anything other than normal when I was growing. When you're in the middle of it, you just assume that it's what everybody else lives. And now there was none of that factor going on here. And this one led to social isolation that had nothing to do with abuse, but it didn't help things. So my background was Ukrainian and my parents would cook Ukrainian food, et cetera, et cetera. And I grew up in a very white Anglo-Saxon town. So my friends were Moores and McTavishes and McIvers and McLeans. And there was a Laura Secord. There was a direct descendant of Laura Secord who was part of the 1812 war that separated our 2 nations, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, the bottom line was, if I went to their house, it smelled like roast beef and Yorkshire pudding. When they came to my house, it smelled like boiled cabbage. And that created like a distance. And growing up, there was this ordinary social isolation because the customs were different. The culture was different. So a lonely childhood, that's the best way to describe this. And I didn't learn how to relate to, particularly females, because I had 2 brothers and it was a very dominantly male house. And my mom walked 3 steps behind my dad. That's how I grew up. And Canadian American girls, they don't like that too much. You have to learn how to talk differently when you're in the middle of all this. A great failure as I was going through trying to bond with somebody who would become a life partner. I just didn't know how to do it. Just had not a clue. So to learn the hard way. And anyway, it wasn't for lack of trying.
Right. But do you think the way you grew up influenced your career decision?
Actually, it's the strangest thing. My career decision wasn't something that neither I nor my dad planned. The plan was, and this is an interesting story, because this is how the beginning of the healing happened. So I remember there was a night, and there would be these. When my dad was drunk, he was awful. When he was sober, he was wonderful. That's the only way I could describe it. When he was a little boy, he got kicked by a horse. The horse broke his jaw. He wound up almost dying. And then his sister saved his life by getting him to a hospital. But that sister ran a strip joint. And my dad had been a bouncer in that strip joint. So the hero of his life was the lady who ran the strip joint, which did not help my ability to bond with females.
This conversation is going around.
So yeah, it is. So this is the background. And there was lots of dysfunction there. My mom was actually a bit of a saint. She saved the family. She opened a restaurant and put my dad's name on the sign of the restaurant. And then eventually he left what he was doing and he started into the diner. And this diner became an ordinary place. And that was the place where I started to learn what it meant to be in an ordinary relationship with ordinary people. And I met the common people every day kind of thing. But getting back to this, there was a moment I was standing by the refrigerator, getting ready to go to bed one night. And my dad was standing next to me. And he was a combination of either an agnostic or an atheist, depending on how the wind blew. The agnostic part was when he'd see something grow. And he'd marvel at the wheat in the field, or he'd marvel at a tree coming out of the ground or something. And he'd say, there's got to be something out there. The atheist part came when there was an earthquake and innocent and evil people were killed side by side in an earthquake. And he said, there can't be any kind of a God. And I had a dramatic conversion. I said yes to the claims of Christ. But I was standing by this refrigerator, and I'm a believer and he's not. And my marks were within 1 or 2% of each point. So here's what happened in my family. My younger brother rebelled, my older brother withdrew, and I performed. And that was the pattern that was in my family. And so my average was 88% at the graduation for high school, 88.2% or something like this. Anyway, I did this real achievement kind of thing. But all the marks were within 1% of each other, all the way across the line. Except for auto engines. I flunked auto engines. So I knew I was never going to be a mechanic. So standing by the refrigerator one night, I said to my dad, I don't know what I'm going to do with my life. And then this is one of the moments that was happening. He looked at me and he got the sparkle in his eyes and he said, son, have yourself a good sleep. You'll wake up in the morning and you'll know. So I thought, oh, brother, okay. So I went upstairs, went to sleep, and I woke up the next morning and I knew I was going to be a pastor.
Really?
I did. So listen, there's a story that includes my dad, and it's how he got healed of abuse and how I got healed of my background.
Wow.
So let me tell you how this thing, because the call was actually the thing that set both of us on a healing trajectory. So I wake up, so I go to the school, and now my parents went to absolutely, totally, completely nominal nothing. The only reason why they ever went anywhere, there was a pastor who'd go down the street and he'd show up and visit everybody any hour of the day or night. And he didn't care that my relatives had bad backgrounds. He didn't give a rip. He just showed up whenever anybody was in trouble. He would be there at 2:00 in the morning or 3:00 in the morning. Whenever you called him, he was available and he'd be there. And so my parents began to respect this guy, even though they didn't know what they believed. Mom was a nominal Catholic and dad didn't believe anything. But in the end, he liked the guy. And so he made me go to that church, even though he didn't go himself. So anyway, the bottom line was, I feel this call. And I go into my high school and I have a couple of spares. It's my last semester in school. I have a couple of spare periods. And so I book in to see a guidance counselor. And the guidance counselor says, what would you like? I said, I'm trying to navigate my career choice. I think I'm going to be a pastor. He said, what church do you belong to? I said, oh, I don't like it. He said, why don't you come to my church? I said, oh, I'm happy to do that. But it was the same denomination, just different pastor. And I wasn't sure that I wanted to do that. He said, look, I'll set up a phone call. You can go and see him. As it turned out, the guy was available in my next spare that very same day. So I got in a little beat up car and I drove across town and went to see this pastor. And he was a delightful English guy. And he had a pipe that he smoked and he blew smoke rings while he talked about Jesus. Put his feet on the desk and he just started chatting and talking. And he was just this absolutely delightfully warm guy. And there's a bit of a funny thing here. I play the accordion because I'm ethnically Ukrainian. This guy played the accordion for his children's story, that kind of thing. So there was these things in common. Anyway, the guy says, you need to bloom where you're planted, he says. You got to go back to the other church. I said, oh, I don't like it there. And he said, I think they love you there. And if you go back there, you'll just be received with open arms. You can come here if you want, but you got to bloom where you're planted. So I thought, okay, let's see what we can do. So I called the pastor up who visited one of our relatives. And he's free the next day. So I get up in the morning and I go to see him. And it's one of my spare periods. And I sit down in his office. He said, "You're going into the ministry." I said, "How did you know?" He said, "I've been praying about it for 6 months. I know you're going into ministry." And by the way, our church is 100 years old. We're a centennial year this year. We haven't had a candidate for years. You'll be our centennial candidate. The board meets tonight. Can I put your name forward? I said, "What?" He said, "We're going to put your name forward tonight." So he put my name forward. And as it turned out, ordinarily in that denomination, it'd be like the United Methodists in the States now. It's equivalent to that. Anyway, coming back up here. So it was the United Church of Canada. Yeah, you know about that because you're half Canadian. You know about the United Church. Anyway, the bottom line was they had these 3 committees that met, and usually over a 2-year period, and you'd have to go to each of these different things to get yourself in. And all 3 of the committees were meeting in the next week. And I got through all 3 of them. And it was signed, sealed, and delivered. And now I had funding to be able to go to school. And the thing is stamped, it's done. A board of elders has said yes. And so I see my dad after all of this is done. I haven't told him a word of this. And I said, so we're mopping the floors, and he always had a shot of whiskey and he always had a cigarette. And he would have the shot of whiskey, have a cigarette. And the routine was I'd come home from school, we'd mop the floors together and clean the grease off the fence to get the diner ready for the next day's work. And so we're doing this. And I said to my dad, "Dad, when I stood by the refrigerator and you said I should wake up in the morning," and I'd know. He said, "Yeah, I remember that. So you got an idea?" He said, "Yeah, I'm going to be a pastor." And he turned white as a ghost and his jaw dropped. The cigarette fell out of his mouth. And he looked at me and he said, "We have to talk." I said, "Okay, let's do it." So he sits me down. He gets that shot of whiskey. He takes the drink. He turns white as a ghost. He starts to physically shake. And I said, "Dad, what happened?" And he said, "Do you remember when I said you should go to sleep and you'd wake up the next day and know what you're going to do with your life?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "I went down to my bed and I lay down. Your mother was fast asleep. I got into bed and I closed my eyes, and suddenly in front of my eyes was the risen Lord walking over to me and telling me that I had to go up and ask you what you were dreaming." He shook me awake, and then he told me a series of things about your life. He told me that you would be a pastor. He told me that you were going to travel the earth. He told me you're going to go and speak to many large crowds, large and small, that you're going to write books, and you're going to just do this to bless his church, and that I was to go and wake you and ask you what you were dreaming. And so he was in this half dazed kind of state. He got up out of bed. He ran up the stairs. He tried to wake me up. I had 2 brothers on the other side. All 3 of us were in the same room in those days. It shook me. I didn't wake up. And he woke up. So he said to himself, "That's the craziest dream I ever had in my entire life." So he had to believe that kind of stuff. Went back down the stairs, came back into bed, pulled the sheets up, and suddenly the Lord reappeared to him, picked him up by the scruff of his pajamas, stood him on his feet, and said, "You must wake your son David, ask him what he dreams, and then tell him I have called him, and what he's dreaming is true." So he went back up the stairs in this crazy state. And then the dream began, my dream apparently began to fade. The Lord told him to speak to me quickly. So he shook me. Apparently I said, "I'm with the Lord. He's telling me that I'm going to do the following things." And they were the things that my dad had heard the Lord say. And then he said to me, "I'm supposed to tell you that every one of the things you said to me is true. You're supposed to be a pastor, and it's supposed to happen quickly." So that's what happened to him. And it began the process of him coming to sobriety and him giving up cigarettes and him starting to order his life. There was one day, like 2 years later, we were mopping floors together, and there was no cigarette and there was no glass of whiskey. I said, "Dad, you given up the smoke?" And he said, "Son, you're going to be a pastor. You can't have a drunk for a dad if you're going to be a pastor. So I have given up drinking, and I'm doing my best to stop smoking."
That is crazy powerful.
That's what he said. And so
You
he
didn't
stopped.
give me any warning to that. That's so
Uh,
beautiful.
There's more to the story. I'll just
Okay,
finish. So
but I have to pause and say that was beautiful. I'll stop
it's
talking.
also the beginning of my healing, because I started to become hungry to know what the scripture was about. I had not a clue. I didn't know there was Genesis or a Matthew in that book. I didn't know how to find it. And so I started to go to
Wait a minute. You wanted to be a pastor and you didn't know those little
hardly
things?
knew a thing about the Bible. And so I started to
Wow.
go to all kinds of different gatherings of Christians, and I met people from every walk of life. And there were believers who were young and old and in between, and there were people who were male and female and large and small and every race and nation. They all had different expressions of their faith, but I started to meet them and discuss the things of Christ with them. And in the middle of that, I began to mature as a result of this process. So it was the most amazing kind of a thing, because here's the bottom line. Every one of us has got our faults. You have some, I have some, everybody else has some. But when you're with the great church, that the power of the Lord to forgive is profound. And the power of God to save a life is profound. And when you meet somebody who came from the dregs and now is a successful businessman, or you meet somebody who just was in a terrible way in an abuse victim, and they come out the other side because the grace of God has healed them and forgiven them, and they found a lovely partner in life. When you meet people like that and they tell you their stories, it becomes healing for you. And you start to believe that you can change too. So here's what happened with my dad. Of course, he was this agnostic who had this thing happen to him. And he just didn't know what to do with it. What do you do when the risen Lord appears to you? So he did this thing, and it was irrational, right? He just did this dream thing. He was aware in his cognition that it was true, but in his heart of hearts, he didn't know what he believed yet. And there was this, and I would pray for my dad all the time. And there was this moment where I was in a prayer meeting at the university I was attending. There was a Bible study and there was a prayer meeting. The Bible study was Tuesday, the prayer meeting was Thursday. Every time I showed up at the prayer meeting, I would ask people to pray for my dad because he was a broken, wounded soul. I would ask them to pray for him, ask him that he would become whole, that he become healed, that he become well. And in the third year of praying like that, people would, as soon as I would walk in, we got to pray for David's dad. We got to pray. So in the third year of doing that, I walked into the room and I started to do this crazy kind of cry out, beg kind of prayer. Oh God, to save my dad. And there was a girl in the room. Her name was Joanne. She looked at me and she said, David, do you think you have to remind the Lord about your dad all the time? I said, yeah, isn't that what the Bible says you're supposed to do? He said, no. When you pray, your prayer passes through time and space, and it pierces the veil, and it goes into eternity, and it stays there. And that prayer stays before the throne of grace until God orchestrates the event inside the flow of time and space to send the answer. Sometimes it's immediate, sometimes it takes a long time, but that prayer is eternal and it never ends. I never forgot the words from that young lady named Joanne. It was just the most amazing thing. And in the middle of that meeting,
How does she know that?
She knew it because she just knew it. Long time, mature Christian. So these were things that matured me, that healed me. So there was a guy in the room named John, and he looked at me and he said, David, I have to tell you something. I said, what's that? He said, your prayer for your dad's been answered. And that was the Thursday. Okay. Now, something went snap inside my soul. Something just went snap. And I knew inside that what he said was true. So I had this great expectation for what was going to happen next. Now, my dad and I had a custom. It happened every Sunday. I'd say, Dad, do you want to go to church? He'd say, no. Happened every Sunday. So let me tell you what happened. This Sunday, I was expecting something different because of what had happened in that meeting after 3 years of praying with that moment.
Right.
And I said, Dad, do you want to go to church with me? He said, no, I have to change the storm windows and the screens. We have apartments. We have 5 apartments. And back in the day, they didn't have these beautiful slider windows. They had to take the screens off and put the storms up. And it was time for winter and that kind of thing. And if you're from Maine, you know what I'm talking about. Anyway, So I was so disappointed. And he said, yeah, I got to do that. So I go to church. I come back home. And my dad looks at me and he says, we have to talk. I said, okay, Dad, when? He said, next Sunday. You'll ask me for church. I'm going to say no, and we'll talk after church. I said, okay, Dad. So I wait a whole week. I said, Dad, you going to church? He said, no, I told you I'm not going, but we're going to talk. After church, he sat me down, and once again, he began to physically shake, and he turned white as a ghost. I said, Dad, what happened? He said, son, this is where it started. He started with hilarity, and it moved to this serious thing. The hilarious thing was this. He said, son, I told you I had to change the storm windows and the screens. I said, oh, yeah, Dad, I know. I was disappointed. And he said, you know, the storeroom where we keep those things, there's a low beam. I said, Dad, I have met that beam many a time. He said, that beam and I had a conversation. He said, I said, Dad, that doesn't surprise me. He said, David, I have to tell you something else. When I hit my head in that beam, I swore. I said, Dad, I'm sorry to tell you this, but this doesn't surprise me either. And then he said, oh, yes, son, but I have to tell you what else happened. When I hit my head in that beam, I didn't just swear. I took the name of your Lord in vain. I shouldn't have done that. I said, Dad, you shouldn't. He said, I know, until I heard a voice behind me say yes. And he turned around And the risen Lord was standing in the doorway of that storage room, and they locked eyes. Now, my dad had lost a lot of his eyesight when he was kicked by that horse when he was a little boy. So he had Coke bottle thick glasses. He had to drop out of school when he was in grade 3. And he had that violent background. And so his life was stacked against him. He got through life by laughing and telling stories and getting drunk. And he was starting to give up the drink at this point. And the Lord appears to him, and he's gazing into the Lord's eyes. And I said, Dad, what was it like? He said, it was like looking into wells of love. I have to tell you something. He did not read Tennyson for a good time. He was not fluent with poetry or beauty of language. And when he said that, I knew it was real. I said, what did you say to him? He said, I couldn't stop looking at him. And we were silent for the longest time. And then I told the Lord that I love my son. And Jesus nodded his head and said, I know this. And then my dad said, I'm a sinner. And then Jesus said, I forgive you. And he vanished. That's how my dad began the process of becoming whole. And it was intertwined with my call to ministry, to serve. And it's exactly as he said. Actually, it's interesting. When I married my wife, she was a prayerful girl. And she was given a vision of me traveling around the planet and speaking and teaching, that kind of thing. And she and my dad looked at each other, and they both got this insight together, and they got to know each other. And I said, will you tell me? They said, no. I said, why not? I said, because if we tell you, you'll try and do it yourself. You're supposed to seek him, and God's going to set it up when you're not expecting it. And that's happened with every single thing that I've ever done with my entire life. I have sought him. And in the middle of all of this, things would happen that I was not planning on or counting on. And the next thing you know, I'd be doing something national or international in nature. So it's the craziest, most wonderful kind of thing. So my healing had to do with my encounter with the Lord that was shared with my dad, who was involved in my call to ministry.
Wow. It's quite the story. I'm glad I'm glad to hear it. Yeah. Very much. Yeah.
So listen, I'll just tell you this. I believe in a supernatural gospel. I believe that the Lord does speak to us. I believe that God does heal today. I do believe that the Lord moves in power. I do believe that the Lord is more than able to accomplish anything that needs to be done. And he's God and we're not.
Yeah. And I think one of the most beautiful parts of your story too is that your dad was not a believer.
He was not.
You have to be a believer to get help from God.
That's correct. In fact, if you read the Bible, you'll discover this. The enemies of Israel, the enemies of God, heard the voice. In fact, my favorite thing when I'm talking to young preachers is I say, listen, do you think God can't speak to you so you can speak to a congregation? They'll nod their heads. No, we're not good enough. He said, God spoke to Balaam's donkey. This is a story in the Bible where the Lord appears to a donkey and speaks to the donkey so that the donkey can correct the sorcerer who's doing something wrong. He talks to the sorcerer. He talks to the donkey. In the end, the sorcerer repents and the donkey. And listen, if God can speak to a donkey, if God can speak to an enemy. In fact, my devotion this morning was reading the story of a man who fought against Israel as a leader of his army. And the king of his country, which was an enemy of Israel, sends a letter to the king of the other country, Israel, so that he'd get healed of his leprosy. In the end, the enemy of Israel gets healed of leprosy because he seeks the Lord. He speaks, it's a story of Naaman the Syrian. It's in 2 Kings chapter 5. That was my devotion this morning. The guy was an enemy. God spoke to him. He didn't actually believe in the God of Israel. He said, and actually, I don't know if you know the history here. If you were a king of an ancient culture, you believe that your God gave you the victory when you won a battle. And you believe you were being punished by the God, but the other God was stronger if you lost the battle. That's how they thought. And so for Naaman the Syrian to ask the king of Israel to have somebody pray for his healing was to admit that his God was not as strong as the other God. And it's a crazy story. And in the end, the guy gets healed. So you have this. So listen, if the scripture says it, and if experience tells us this, you don't need to be somebody who's got a clean walk, a holy walk, a perfect walk, a righteous walk. You just need to be able to pay attention when the signals show up.
Mhm.
That's all you need.
And oh, wow. Thank you for sharing all that. When did you get started writing books?
You know what? I got started writing books because I was trying to help the Ugandans. So here's what happened. I wrote this book in 2008, pushing into 2009. And the very first ones to receive this were the Tribal Society people of Northern Uganda. And here's what happened. My congregation decided to help them rebuild after the madness of Joseph Kony and the madness of Idi Amin. And the northern part of Uganda had been ravaged and had been a war zone for more than 20 years. And so kids in that town didn't know how to read, didn't know how to write, never been to a dentist, never been to a doctor. They didn't have any kind of proper governance. They had come out of this thing as refugees from the war zone. And my congregation, Spruce Grove Alliance Church in Spruce Grove, Alberta, just outside Edmonton, partnered together with two American congregations, one in New York State and one in Atlanta, Georgia. And we just decided that we would spend significant time and energy. And I took on the northern field. The Church in New York State took on the town of Gulu, and the church in Atlanta took on working with the poor inside Kampala. And so our three congregations did 1 week events where we would train pastors, and we would do build projects with volunteers from our congregations building infrastructure. So we built a latrine, we built a school, we built a library, and we paid for those pastors, and it was a significant amount of energy and time. But here's what happened. I wrote this book to give to the Ugandans to train them because they didn't have resources. And so the first 16,000 copies of that book were distributed in Uganda to the people that I'd spent 3 years training. We raised the money.
Just 16,000?
16,000 for that part. Yes, that's what happened with those. Then the book itself got published here after we gave those books away to the people in Uganda. But the intention was not to be, again, same sort of thing. I wasn't trying to do it. I was trying to help the Ugandans. And in the end, this thing turned into a manuscript that turned into a book that got published in the United States and Canada. But there's a connection here between Uganda and the healing prayer book that's right here that has a story in it about my wife getting well. My wife was afflicted with muscular dystrophy, FSH, muscular dystrophy. Now, that particular kind of affliction is becoming known inside the United States because the founder of Lululemon has manifested the symptoms of FSH muscular dystrophy. And he has just given a $100 million donation to the Muscular Dystrophy Association of the United States. So we're talking about this now becoming part of current culture. About a year and a half ago, he made that big donation. So here's what happens with that particular affliction. It starts with your head. Your face muscles sag, your shoulder blades go out of position between 16 and 20. You're in chronic pain from the time you're 16 to 20. And then if you damage a muscle, you lose it forever. The muscles on the abdominal area begin to hollow out. You have difficulty standing. You can't raise your arms above your shoulders after about 10 years of this affliction. And it's a plateau decline disease. And actually, one of the little idiosyncrasies of it is that you can't whistle because your facial muscles don't work, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I have a good friend who had it.
But FSH, I'm talking about that. So listen, Elizabeth's mother had it, her sister has it, her niece has it, she had it. And it was genetic. That's how it works. So anyway, the bottom line was I'm going back and forth to Uganda. I'm training these pastors. And we spent, listen, $500,000, $500,000 because we would train 750 to 1,000 pastors at a time. And we paid their transportation. We paid their meals. We got them books and notebooks. And we gave them those books, etc. $500,000. That's a lot of money. So my elders looked at me and they said, David, that's a lot of money. We need to bring the guy into our church to have him speak. And I said, look, he's a tribal society Ugandan. The culture gap between me and females was big. You think that's big? You should you should see the gap here. And he said, he's one of these leaders of the tribe and he barks orders and people shine his shoes and all that kind of thing. And they said, is he anointed? I said, yes. And he's got a burden for those pastors. He wants to train them. He wants to give them an opportunity to rebuild his country. He said, then bring him. Just warn the church 3 weeks in a row with Tribal Society, African tribal heads talk. I didn't know if I was going to get fired or not. Anyway, here's what happens. He gets off the plane and I was praying fervently that he wouldn't be an idiot. And he looked at me and he said, now, David, I don't know what this is about, but every time I pray for your church, the Lord has told me I'm supposed to speak quietly and be gentle. Does that make any sense to you? I said, oh, yeah. So anyway, here's what happens. he was one of these guys who was involved in the transformation of his nation in the middle of the times when there were wars going on in the north and the south of his country. And he told all these deliverance from death war stories and about people praying in the streets and crying out to God and lives being spared. And it was an incredible testimony. So he's preaching. I had 3 services on the weekend in those days. I had a Saturday night, a Sunday morning at 9, and a Sunday morning at 11. And there were 3 very different kinds of crowds. The Saturday night was guitar unplugged and leave me alone because I want to sleep in, right? And the Sunday morning at 9 o'clock were the conservative types who wanted to come in there and have 3 hymns, 3 points in a poem. And the 11 o'clock guys were the ones who wanted to wave their arms and sing and dance, that kind of thing. Very different congregations. And so the guy shows up on the Saturday night and he tells these electrifying deliverance from death war stories. And everybody in the crowd starts texting their friends saying, you got to hear this guy. And so they walk up to us at the end of the service on Saturday night and they said to the preacher, you got to tell different stories. Would you tell different stories? We're coming again tomorrow morning. And so the crowd from Saturday night shows up for the conservative crowd at 9 o'clock. And so the 2 crowds are mixed together. And of course, now the sanctuary is about 3/4 full. And all the people in the 9 o'clock service start texting their friends and saying, they got to come and hear this guy because his stories are electrifying. And they show up for the 11 o'clock service and it is jammed to capacity and people are along the walls and up and down the things. And I'm sitting on the steps where I tell the children's story. And he's in the pulpit and he's preaching with his thick Ugandan accent. And partway through his sermon, remember I told you this, my wife could not raise her arms above her shoulders and hadn't been able to for more than 20 years. She was unable to get up and down steps. She had to pick her leg up and move it to the next step and balance herself and then grab the banister and pull herself up and then take the other leg and do it to be able to go upstairs to go to bed at night. I had to pick her up out of bed in the morning and get her to the hot shower so she would be able to put the hot water on herself so she'd be limber enough to take care of the 2 kids and so on. It was this rapid decline, plateau decline thing. And we're at the point where friends had to clean the house because she couldn't move the couch to vacuum under it. She couldn't move the coffee table to go around it. And so all kinds of care was happening. People were kind to us. And at that point, we've been in that church 5 years. Now, here's what happens. I am sitting on the step next to this man when suddenly he stops and he looks at me and he speaks in his thick Ugandan accent and he says, David, what is M.A.? Master of Arts. I don't know. And then he said,
I was like, wait a minute.
No, something's wrong. Something's wrong. And he puts his head on the pulpit and he starts to, now listen to this, people lined up along the walls waiting. He was in the middle of one of these deliverance from death war stories and he hadn't got to the climax of the story. So we don't know if the person's going to live or die. And he's praying. And they all want to hear the story, right? And he's praying. And then he looks up and he says this, it's a wasting muscle disease. It starts in your head and it goes down into your face and causes your shoulder blades to go out of position. You get into chronic pain between 16 and 20. And when you do that, sometimes you get scoliosis and your muscles disintegrate from the center of your being and you have trouble standing up. And you don't die young, but if you damage a muscle, you lose it forever. He was giving a perfect medical description of FSH, muscular dystrophy, and he'd never read a book about it. And then I'm looking at my wife because I'm realizing what he's talking about. I'm looking at her. And then he says this, whoever has this, Jesus has just healed you. And my wife's arms went above her head for the first time in more than 20 years. Her arms were, all the pain in her body and she began growing muscle tissue. Genetic transformation. And it happened in front of all three congregations gathered together in the same service. And they knew us. She was walking with canes and she was having trouble getting up steps. And we had to put
a true miracle.
It was
to her.
A miracle in the middle. And here's how it happened. I was not looking for a miracle. In fact, we had prayed many times for God to heal my wife. I can't tell you how many times we prayed that. And there was no result. Just continual plateau decline. Sometimes a little improvement, then plateau decline. And we just thought, okay, her mom's a faithful believer. Her sister's a faithful believer. She's a faithful believer. They're all in a wheelchair. That's how it's going to be. And here's what happened. We had guests in our home who'd come to hear this guy because they wanted to know whether or not they were going to travel with me to Uganda to help do the build project. And they had known us for 20 plus years. And they're in the church and they watch her arms go above her head and their jaws hit the ground. And the people who were sitting around us just could not believe this amazing kind of thing. So we go into our kitchen, and here was the plan. I was gonna get on the chair to get the heavy pots and pans off the top shelf so she'd cook up lunch for our guests. She pushes me out of the way. She stands on the thing and she pulls down the heavy pots and pans herself. A week later, when we were disciplining our daughter, she ran up the stairs with our daughter, and then she ran down the stairs. She had not done that for decades. It was the most incredible and astonishing. And it happened in front of 650 witnesses. Now, our doctor knew us for 5 years. He knew about us. He knew how to treat this. He was giving us accommodations. He was recommending us to this society or that society to get that we could, so that she could get accommodations around the declining health and so on. He waited 3 years, and then he wrote the note. And the note said, all traces of FSH muscular dystrophy have gone from this body. They're not there.
Is he now a believer?
But they took they just couldn't wrap their brain. The scientific culture just doesn't know how to do this. But that story is in this book, the Healing Prayer Book. That story is in there.
That's so beautiful, David.
And again, all we decided to do was to help the Ugandans. In fact, there came a point where we decided not to do any more seeking of healing. We decided we would seek the healer, not the healing. And in the middle of seeking the healer, the healing came. Not because we were trying to make her well, but because we were trying to serve the Lord in any way that we could. And all we were trying to do was to help the helpless in North Uganda. There was a boomerang effect that came back and blessed. God did that.
I didn't know that story. I clearly have not read the book yet. I'm eager to. We have to wrap up just because I got an appointment here in 6 minutes. For people listening that are suffering, because of trauma, complicated grief, medical issues, like whatever it is, what words of comfort do you want to give them today before we
listen? There are 5 ways that God brings healing. One is the instant miracle, like the story I just told. The second is natural healing, where your body's recuperative powers just kick into gear and away you go. And I didn't used to think that was miracle until my wife grew muscle tissue. See, before she was ill, she never grew muscle tissue. After she was healed, the muscle tissue just grew. That's amazing. Okay. Third is a pathway to a remedy. And God, listen, if somebody has done research for 25, 30 years on the affliction that you have, and there's guidance to a remedy, take it. It's a gift.
Yes.
Okay. Now, the next is this suffering without purpose, where people are just in the middle of this and they don't understand why. I have come to realize that there are seasons where we pass through suffering and we don't know why we're doing that. And at the end, understanding comes. And sometimes understanding doesn't come until right toward the end of your days. But listen, persevere in the middle of that. God is still the guide. And the last is the victorious crossing, where the believer says yes to Christ and you pass through the gates of death to life. And all 5 of those are legitimate. Don't let anybody guilt you into thinking that because you didn't get the instant cure, you're a substandard Christian or something like this. No, there's science which operates on cause and effect, and there's miracle, which is God's miraculous intervention. And they work side by side in different categories, and every now and then they overlap. And sometimes they separate out. And sometimes all 5 of those pathways intertwine together until you come to the place where you encounter God in the middle of it. What I would say to all of you is, if you want to understand how prayer for healing works, if you want to understand how your wounded soul can become well, and by the way, I do talk about emotional healing in that book. I talk about emotional healing, and I talk about mental healing, and I talk about physical healing, all those different pathways. It's a co-write with a Methodist pastor from the States who was the head of the upper room for years and years. So if you've read those little upper room pamphlets, that's the guy. His name is Maxie Dunham. He wrote 50 plus books. And so he's now 89. He's going to turn 90 in August. And this is 2024. So if this gets released in 2025, he'll be 90 by the time you hear this. But regardless of that, he's full of wisdom, full of all kinds of anecdotes from all of his life. And the book itself teaches people the pathway to a remedy as you are in the middle of your emotional, your mental, your physical, your spiritual crisis. we put tools in there to help guide you toward a place where you can become whole and well. So I would encourage you, get that book anywhere books are sold, because Whitaker House is the publisher. So you can go to Walmart and say, oh, by the way, I want the Healing Prayer book by Chotka and Dunham, and you can get the book. It'll come to you. You can go to Books A Million. You can go to Barnes and Noble. It's there. Or you can go to Amazon if you like to do that, because that's easy now. Or you can go to the website in the United States, Shop the Word, which belongs to Whitaker House. Anywhere books are sold, you can get that. I would encourage you to read that book, because it's a pastoral approach that will not beat you up when you are in emotional anguish. I lived through emotional despair and came out the other side. And you heard the story of how God began that process today. That story is not in the book. You got a special on that one. But
people listening. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. That story, I've not reduced that to writing. I'm just in the middle of attempting to get that done so that we can do something faithful around what it means to hear the voice of God. So listen, I would encourage you to take a look at that and pick the book up. And it's also, by the way, it's an audiobook. It's an ebook. It's a trade paperback. And in the fall time, there's going to be a group of people produce 15 videos for study. There'll be 10 minutes each. You can use that as a small group to study. If you're in small groups that therapy sessions, you can do this. I know some people do that in churches. Some people do that at Alcoholics Anonymous, et cetera, those kinds of things.
You going to send it to me, the link?
I haven't got it yet because it's not produced yet. They're going to be released in the fall, but I'll send you the link to the book.
What are you waiting for, David?
It's not my production time. It's somebody else's. If I could have it yesterday, I would have it to you now. But I did the video recording a few months ago, and they tell me that it's going to be released in September. So I wish I could get it to you sooner.
Okay. Sorry about that. I guess too excited. It was such an honor to have you today. If you keep on doing what you're doing, we're probably going to have you back. You're just got a lot of good going on.
I'd love to come back and be your guest again. It would be a delight to do that.
Yes.
So you want people to know how to reach me? Go to my website, spiritequip.com. And there's links to my Facebook page. There's links to my Twitter, rather to my YouTube channel, to my blog spot, to my YouTube. It's all there. You just go to spiritequip.com, and there's links to my books as well. And if you want me to come and speak, I do speak on 3-day events, and you can book me there if you want to do that. I also teach Zoom courses and have people learn from me in 6-week to 8-week installments.
Okay, that's so awesome. Thank you again.
You're more than welcome, and may God bless.
God bless you too. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening in today. Please join us next week, same day and time. Also, I would love for you to check out my website, healthrivedream.com.